Hello, I'm David Bianco. Welcome back to the channel. And if it's your first time, thank you for joining. You picked a good one because this is my special 1-year anniversary episode. Yes, it's been a year. March 1st, 2022 was when I launched this channel. And now with nearly 2,000 subscribers and a lot of views and a lot of hours and a lot of likes and a lot of comments, we're still going strong. And March 1st also represented this year the 50th anniversary of the release of Pink Floyd's classic Dark Side of the Moon. Now, here's the irony. I call the channel the Audio Excursion because I intend to take you different places, sometimes virtually in time and sometimes physically. Well, this year I actually was standing outside Abbey Road Studios on March 1st. The very studios where The Dark Side of the Moon was recorded. So I'm going to be giving you some special information on this particular episode related to the engineer Alan Parson and his work, and also share with you some audio of an early mix of Dark Side of the Moon so that you can see how it evolved. Because a classic album like this deserves special treatment. That's coming up next here on the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion. So my trip to the UK was a 2-day trip on a 12-day total trip that I was in Europe. And the whole intent there was to do a little bit of touring and checking out some record shops and also seeing some of the sites related to the Beatles' history. And of course, you can't do that without seeing Abbey Road itself. And so the album Dark Side of the Moon was displayed there. It was actually painted on one of the brick posts outside of the building. And it was, I'm sure, partly because here we are at the 50th anniversary. This album has sold so many copies. It's been on the charts so many consecutive years. There's just so many aspects to this album. I know the pressings are a big topic. Which ones are the best? The early UK, the 2A, 2B releases are fabulous. Of course, myself being in the US, when I was able to get this, the Mobile Fidelity MFSL version that was a half-speed master, I got that when it came out. And it certainly was a huge improvement over the US, mainly in the quietness of the vinyl, because it is an album that deserves quiet vinyl because of some of the quieter passages. But over the years, as I've had different versions and sold different versions and listened to different ones, I pretty much settled on the best value being this Pro Use series, this EMI Toshiba Pro Use series, Japanese, because I think it represents the best sound and value together. And I think they can be found at a reasonable price. But the album itself is a classic over time. And speaking of time, we have the classic song time on there with all those clocks at the beginning. Well, the recording of that was done at a local clock shop near Abbey Road. Now, the engineer on this album, Alan Parson, had a lot of challenges, and he brought a lot of talent to this. And those are, in fact, the clocks that he recorded there and got them going off in different unison in order to get that very sound that we enjoy, that is such a dramatic break in the structure of side one. And the song itself is so impactful in terms of the meaning of the song. And here we are 50 years later, still enjoying it and speaking of time. And as time has elapsed, we've come to learn more and more about this album. One of the things I've been able to procure is an early mix of this album, and it certainly has some differences in it. And I'm going to share a few of those differences with you in the background. I'm going to be playing some of these pieces in the background as I voice over because I really don't want to get a bunch of strikes on me. But I want you to hear that there were definitely evolutionary tactics that were used by the band and by Alan Parsons to finally flesh out the very product that we have enjoyed these 50 years. Starting with the very intro, the very first track of side one, you're going to hear in the background here a slow buildup of sound that then goes into a bridge that you're used to and the beginning vocals. But the whole beginning of this was done differently, and then you'll see, it was enriched by the actual outcome that we're all used to listening to in the actual release of the first track of Dark Side of the Moon. So with that intro of Speak to Me being different, we then get into the track Breathe, which is pretty much the same on this early mix as it is on the final. On the Run has some differences only in that there's less intensity in some of the audio of the breathing of the runner during that track. And then we get into Time, the track with the clocks and the heavy laden theme of Time is all the same. That pretty much is 100% like the final mix. But when we get into track 5, The Great Gig in the Sky, that's where it really is different. Now, where the difference is not in the music, but it is in fact the fact that the vocal that was done by Claire Torrey, which really are not words at all, but emotions, and her singing out in a way that is very classical. I mean, it very much is something that is in ratings of best vocals, was rated behind Bohemian Rhapsody as the best vocal in a song, ironically. So it's a very well-known situation. Claire Torrey came in under the advisement of Alan Parsons. The band didn't know who she was. She had done some cover work in the previous times, and Alan was aware of her. And she was told to basically get into the song and emote from it. And after about a dozen or so takes, they got to where she gave this climactic kind of performance that we all know so well. But the original had in it actually several different approaches, one of which I have here in the background was NASA space missions with astronauts speaking to mission control. And of course, this really sounds out of place and different compared to what Great Gig in the Sky ended up being. But Pink Floyd was working toward trying to figure out whether to even keep the Great Gig in the Sky on the album at all. And frankly, until Claire Torrey's rendition of the vocal came in and blended so well with it and gave it some depth and meaning, it may not have been on the album at the end of the day if that hadn't happened. The next song on the album, Money, which was the beginning of side 2 on the LP, was certainly a big surprise for Pink Floyd in that it made the top 40. Now, this particular song had a very pronounced start with the sound of a cash register and coins and paper tearing and other sounds that made up a motif of a 7-beat loop. But in this early mix, all you heard were some coins rustling around at the beginning, and it really didn't have this same pronounced sound that it did in the final cut. So we can see that actually this final cut that we all love and enjoy really was quite an improvement. Now, this particular song with the coins being used, there are a variety of stories of how they got in there. Some reports are Roger Waters had recorded them. Some are that Nick Mason had some coins on a string that were used. And Alan Parsons himself, as recently as 2015, has said, no, these were coins that were just recorded as they were dropped in the console studio mixer on top of it. And that is how it was recorded. Well, no matter how it was done, it certainly was effective. And just as effective was the ending of the song, where there were some overdubs of people. And so what was done here is that Alan Parson was involved in contributing this weaving of these punctuated voices, and they were serving as what they called witnesses to themes of conflict and insanity. Nick Mason explained that Roger Waters had drafted a series of questions about madness and violence, and they were written down on some cards. They were placed face down on a music stand, and the group then invited people that were in the studio in Abbey Road, anywhere else within the complex, that could come in, musicians, engineers, and read those off. And they took those and recorded them and decided to use some. Now, two of the more notable people that came in to do that were Paul and Linda McCartney. Also coming in was the guitarist for Wings, whose name was Henry McCullough. Now, ironically, Paul and Linda's readings did not get used, but Henry's did. His very line of, "I didn't know I was really drunk at the time," is one that we can all remember. But in this early mix, none of those voices are heard whatsoever. And so again, we can see that these little elements that got added to the recording as the time progressed and the richness was increasing through the participation of Parsons and others really created the masterpiece that we all know was the song Money. The next track, featuring the wonderful saxophone work of Dick Perry, Us and Them, on this early mix is just the piano and the sax almost all the way until they start the vocal of Us and Them. The beat that we have with the drum in the actual release that we all know is totally missing in this, and it does give a different feel for the song. But the rhythm and the beat of the song, having that drum lead in what we're used to listening to, does give it a much better flow than it did in this early presentation of the song. The song Any Color You Like is pretty much the same on this early mix as it is on the one that we're all used to. But when we get to the song Brain Damage, it does change, and it really belongs mainly to the laughter in the background. It is totally different and in some ways a lot scarier. And I'm really glad they made the change to this one, because I really was taken aback by the sound of this laughter in Brain Damage. The softening of it somewhat and the way that it approaches us in the actual version we're used to, I think, is much more soothing, if that's the right word to use, than what they originally had planned. And finally, Eclipse stays the same. The ending of the album ends as it did in the original work that they did preparing for this album, and didn't really have any changes to it whatsoever. So there you have it. The classic Dark Side of the Moon. Those are some of the early mixes that were done that Alan Parsons had put together, and the team decided to make changes to, of course, to create the very classic album that we all know and love. But recording is a process, and it takes time and evolution, and we can certainly see how some of that evolution occurred. Giving a guy like Alan Parsons the credit for what he did here, he again was with the Beatles on Let It Be and more predominantly on Abbey Road. It is always important to remember those people behind the band who bring us these capabilities of technical prowess and new innovations, as is the case of Dark Side of the Moon. Of course, Alan Parsons went on to do many more things, many of which I enjoy tremendously, and I give him credit in many ways for the success and the nuances that we always have heard in Dark Side of the Moon. Well, I thank you for joining me on this first anniversary episode. It's been a pleasure for me to be able to bring these to you the past year. I look forward to year number 2. And as always, if you haven't subscribed, please think about doing so by clicking on the black bell down below, and that will get you all notifications. If you'd hit a thumbs up or like, I'd appreciate it for the algorithm, and comments are always welcome. So again, thank you for joining me on this special episode. I hope to see you next time at the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion. Take care, everybody.